Well, thank you, Julia, for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for turning out. And aren't emotions difficult? I've had quite a lot of trouble with mine already today. They don't seem to do what I want them to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey with emotions, and then hopefully add a little bit of something in the second half of the talk to what I guess other people are talking about. So, emotions are troublesome. So when I started out training as a psychotherapist, I started training as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and in that way of working, we're trying to manage our emotions and kind of find a place where they don't completely overcome us and overwhelm us. And that's okay. I still think that's quite a good idea. After I trained as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I went on to train as a Jungian analyst. And there the relationship to emotion changes, because Jung is really interested in meaning and giving our life a kind of a shape through meaning. And therefore, for him, emotions are really in the service of meaning. After a while, when I kind of got back into my Buddhism, I thought a little bit about that, and I thought, well, there's a really big danger there. Because if we start making our emotions meaningful, we're in quite a lot of danger of starting to create narratives or stories about who we are and where we're going. And those stories, when they become reified, made concrete, can become traps and burdens and actually cause more suffering than they're worth. So I've got a criticism about Jung, even though I worked as a Jungian analyst for years. Yeah? So those two ways of working with emotion didn't really work for me. And then I don't know when it was, sometime in the late 90s, I got offered a job to become one of the directors of training at the London Centre for Transpersonal Psychology. And I thought to myself, bugger, what on earth is that transpersonal psychology about? I've got no idea at all. So I started reading around, and I came across somebody called John Wellwood. Has anyone heard of John Wellwood? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. John Wellwood is a clinical psychologist, and he worked with a psychologist when he was doing his PhD called Eugene Gendlin. I think you say it Gendlin. Yeah? Gendlin. Is that right? I'm always a bit anxious at that moment. Another emotion. Anxiety arising. And Gendlin was really interested in what made psychotherapy work. And he believed that what made psychotherapy work was when you ask somebody a question, how are you feeling? You got two sorts of responses. One kind of response was, well, my mother didn't love me, and the dog kind of spat in my bed, and then there was those neighbours next door, and then the sun was in the eclipse, and it sort of goes on and on and on like that. So the person does not answer from the immediacy of their experience. The other person, when you say, how are you, they'd pause for a minute and they'd kind of feel inside a bit and they go, I'm feeling a bit sad, actually. They spoke from the immediacy of their experience. And Gendlin rightly understood that for those people who could speak from the immediacy of their experience, who could connect with their body, last speaker, therapy really worked for them. And those of us who just would go off in this sort of great long narrative, this great long story, it didn't really work so well. So John Wellwood picked this up, but Wellwood was also a student of the infamous Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And so he was trying to integrate his psychotherapy with Buddhism, with the Dharma, Vajrayana Buddhism. And he realized that there were two sorts of felt senses. Now, what's a felt sense? A felt sense is just simply the feeling of our emotion in our body. And of course, our bodies are emotion. It's not that they have emotions, but the body itself is emotion. And by feeling inside, we could actually find the location of the emotion in our body. So I think most of us will know what that means. When I feel anxious, there's a kind of a sicky feeling round here. When I fall in love, there's a kind of beating in my heart. When I can't say something, it's kind of choked up in my throat. Yeah? When I want to punch my wife because she's annoyed me so much, there's a definite sense of contraction in my shoulders. Not that that happens that often. And it's, we feel our emotions in our body. Is that right? Yeah? Good. Whew. Now, what Wellwood discovered was that if we just stay with our emotions in our body and just be present with it, not trying to change it, not trying to understand it, not trying to get rid of it, just being mindfully present. The thing with emotions is that one emotion changes into another, into another, into another, into another. Now we know that as practitioners of the Dharma, don't we? That klesha, emotions, go on forever. They go on for as long as we are not enlightened. They go on forever, until we're enlightened. But John Wellwood also discovered that there was another sort of emotion which, if you stayed with it, opened up into spacious awareness, into rigpa, intrinsic awareness. And he called the ones that go on forever horizontal emotions going through one shift after another, and then just these very, very, very occasional moments, very rare, where emotion would suddenly not lead to another emotion, but would lead to the wide open space of rigpa itself. Now, some people say, well, give me a picture for that. And one of my favourites is, if we consider ourselves to be a house made up of many rooms, each room is an emotion, then it's a bit like going from room to room to room to room to room, sad, angry, anxious, ashamed, sad, angry, anxious, sad, it just goes on and on and on. But occasionally we go into a room and there is a door in that room which opens not into another room, but into the space outside of the building. Yeah. Now, in practice of psychotherapy, I would say that I have had that experience spontaneously in the last 30 years, probably less than 10 times. It's rare. But when it does happen, as Wellwood recognised, it is the most transformative experience that one can possibly have. And again, we know that, don't we? That there's just something about dropping our story and resting in that space of awareness which has clarity and spaciousness. There's something profoundly healing about that. Okay, so that's John Wellwood. In 2000, he published a paper called Reflection and Presence, where he set out these ideas. And he kind of created a bridge where he said that there was, in ordinary therapy, a kind of a dialogic relationship, talking about thoughts and about emotions. And then he talked about a phenomenological or an experience near type of psychotherapy, which was focusing. So that's when the therapist says, where do you feel that in your body? And we take our attention and we rest our attention on the emotion felt in the body. We stay with it. We don't try to change it or alter it, understand it, make meaning from it. We just rest with it. And then meaning comes out of itself. We don't put it on. If we wait, meaning comes. Is there a word or a phrase or an image that really captures what I'm feeling? And then we find out what that word or phrase or image is, and we just stay with it. Now, those of us who've been exposed to the Dharma will recognize that I'm almost giving instructions for the practice of mindfulness, aren't I? And that the only difference is that within the psychotherapeutic context, we're using this method to kind of discover who we personally are. Where if we use exactly the same method, but drop the interest in the self, we're beginning to practice ordinary dualistic mindfulness, shamatha vipassana. And that was the next step. John Wellwood recognised that if we stop being interested in ourselves, but just simply stay with the sensations felt in the body, we're beginning to practice mindfulness. And then going deeper still, that on the other side of dualistic mindfulness, there was the non-dual state of mindfulness, which is Rigpa itself. So it's like he created a whole bridge, a whole spectrum of working with ourselves, from being intensely concerned with our narrative to the process of dropping the narrative and then finding that there was nobody having a narrative in the first place. Yeah? So, I mean, that was quite a long time ago. What, 2000? That's 19 years ago, isn't it? And since that time, I've noticed that there's quite a lot of Buddhist psychotherapists who have picked up this way of working. Tara Brach is one of them, if you're familiar with the work of Tara Brach. Very much exactly the same thing. Recognizing what's going on in our body, feeling the emotion, remaining present, and just recognizing that if we just stay there, the emotion arises, stays, and goes, just as long as we don't chuck any petrol on it and make it last longer. So now I'm going to jump, and I know that there are some students of Soknya Rinpoche in here today, because I've had lunch with them, and which is nice. I was at a retreat in 2013 with Soknya Rinpoche when he discovered much the same thing. I suspect he's got quite a lot of American friends, and they've been chatting to him. Oh, I've lost my glass of water. I'm caught by the wires. It's actually quite a funny story, because you know how when you get an idea and you haven't got it quite formed, you kind of formulate it, don't you? And you kind of have a go at it, and then you have a go at it, and then gradually the idea becomes clearer. And in the morning of the retreat, he'd plainly been trying to work out some kind of structure of understanding. And we had a break, and he went down to have a pee. And plainly, whilst grasping the most inspirational part of the male personality, he came back with the idea fully worked out. And he said if we look into ourselves, so we're observing ourselves, the first level that we come across is a kind of this is my notes from that retreat. It's a kind of diffuse numbness, not really knowing what's going on. And that's true, isn't it? If someone says to me, Nigel, how are you? I actually don't have a clue. I've got no idea at all, and I have to sort of stop a bit and kind of sort of think, well, what is going on? Oh yeah, I didn't know I was feeling that. My wife knew I was feeling that, but I didn't. And then if I go a little bit deeper, I realise that I've actually got a story going on. And there's always a story going on. So, you know, so we've had quite a lot of trouble with my niece recently. And it just seems that most of the conversation revolves around my niece Fern and what she's been up to. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on, ad nauseum. It just kind of fills up your head. Do you know those stories? But within that story, another layer down, there are emotions. And those emotions are felt in the body. So those emotions are actually much, much simpler than the storyline, the narrative. Much more black and white, generally speaking. Much more primitive, much more pure in a sense. And then go down another level. Those emotions are arising as the display of Rigpa within the wide open space of emptiness and clarity, which is lovely. So those are the 4 levels.
So what's the third one?
First one is the diffuse numbness. The second one is the storyline we're running in our thoughts. The third one is going down into the body and the emotions. And then the fourth is the open ground in which they all arise and fall away. Yeah, it's a nice pattern, isn't it? It's really clear. And as Sotni Rinpoche said, unless we get to the basic open ground, Rigpa, we are always governed by hope and fear. Simple. And hope and fear, as you know, are unpleasant and painful. So Sotni Rinpoche developed a practice which is extraordinarily similar to that developed by Gendlin. How am I doing for time? Am I about halfway there?
No, 15 minutes.
Another 15, great. That's where I wanted. 16. Woo! So he developed a practice which he called the handshake practice. Yeah. And what he meant by the handshake practice is that we can take our awareness, take our attention, and place it on our bodies and ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? We may even do this as we're sitting here. Tired, how long is this going on for? My seat's uncomfortable, I wished I hadn't had that big lunch. Those are all the narratives. And then we go underneath and we find in our body, where in my body am I actually feeling something? And then resting our attention on that, what we would call the felt sense, we handshake it. What does handshake mean? When you handshake something, you're not trying to get rid of it. You're not trying to change it. You're just simply holding it. You're holding it in awareness. And then we stay with that with the most enormous amount of kindness and compassion. I would add humour and generosity, and remain present. And from what I've learned in myself and from my students, that's virtually impossible to do. Because what happens is within 2 seconds, we flick back, straight back into the storyline. Yeah? So if I do my niece Fern, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, she's been doing this and she's been doing that. Okay, so where am I feeling that in my body? Oh, I'm feeling a kind of churny feeling here. So let me just stay with that churny feeling. Yeah, but she's really annoying and she's doing this and rah, 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 rah. It's like a mindfulness practice. Then I catch myself and I go back. Yeah, I'm feeling really quite angry actually. That's the word that fits this. Yeah, but I should be feeling angry because she did this and she did that. And so you have this kind of thing. That's how it is, isn't it? It's really difficult to actually stay with the immediacy of the experience and not get tugged back into the storyline. But that's why we practice simple mindfulness, because that is the practice. We're sitting, we're concentrating, resting our attention on a sensation within the body, perhaps the breath or a physical sensation, and then we're caught up in the thoughts. We notice them thinking, and then we come back into the body. So this is exactly the same process, exactly the same movement. Unlike Eugene Gendlin, with the handshake practice, it's also a possibility for those of us who have been introduced to the open state of awareness, the pure awareness of Rigpa, to also use that moment as a jumping off point into that state. Now it's taken me some time, and I'm not sure I really understand this even now, to understand how that junction is made. What I think is meant by it is that when we have a really strong emotion, that emotion in a way is so much more easy to work with because it's so big. And if we've got a really big emotion, it creates a large amount of awareness because it's like it's pushed a button, I can feel it in my body, I really need to be present with this. And then finding myself present with it, coming out of the storyline, down into the body, resting in the spaciousness around that emotion. I think we were talking about space earlier on. We may just catch within that spaciousness the wide open space of the non-dual mind. So there we have it. What do we do with our emotions? We do that. We become aware we're having emotions. We become aware of the narrative. We become aware of the emotion beneath the narrative in our body. And then we become aware that the entirety of that experience is arising within awareness. So that's a kind of like a little history. In the last retreat, I was in a retreat a few weeks back, and Sotli Rinpoche's translator, Harada Aboud, was talking, answering questions, and somebody asked him a question about klesha, about emotion, and working with them. And Harada, from the bottom of his heart, said, "Oh, the habit of these emotions just goes on forever." And you could see that Harada, 10 minutes, had worked a lifetime with his emotions, and they were still causing him the most enormous amount of trouble. I absolutely feel with that. And I've thought a lot about that. Why is it that these habit patterns, why is it so difficult to actually stay with the emotions and not get caught back up in the narrative? What's so difficult about it? And I wrote a book about this called Commercial Break, Why Can't I Meditate? Which is the best book I've ever read. And next to the Kunjigalpo. And in this book, I interviewed loads and loads of struggling meditators, and I very much put myself in that group, who were trying to practice meditation and all felt that they were failing. And I also interviewed a whole spectrum of meditation teachers, some of them secular, people who run the Bangor and the Oxford secular mindfulness courses, 3 different species of Tibetan lamas, a couple of Theravadins, and Stephen Batchelor, secular mindfulness, a couple of others, one from Advaita Vedanta. And I said to them, why are all us struggling meditators, why are we having such a difficulty with this? And they all said, because you're frightened of death. You're frightened of death. Every single one of them, except for Martina Batchelor. And she came up with something else, and she said, "No, that's rubbish," when I told her that. It's not that at all. So she told me what she thought. And then she said, "Why did they all say that?" So I told her, and she said, "Oh, actually, I agree." So that was 100%. So what do they mean? Is there something lethal about meditation? Well, actually, in a way, there is, not for our bodies, but for our sense of self, our sense of who we are. And it's not a big deal, is it? Because if you think about it, you sit down on your bottom on this lovely seat that was described, and in 2 seconds flat, it's not a lovely seat, it's bloody lumpy. And your knees hurt, and you want to move. And if you've got an image of yourself as a wonderful yogi who's immovable, your body's now contradicting it. 10 minutes in, it's boring. Wonder what my emails have sent through today. Have I got anything in the fridge for breakfast? And we're off. So you're back into the narrative, aren't you? And then if that doesn't fit, that's painful as well. And then if you can bear to sit longer, you start to worry about the job in the past, in the future. And if you sit long enough, all the horrible, horrible stuff from the bottom of the pond begins to come up.
And
Someone was
avoidance, isn't there, where you just sleep? I mean, I go absolutely off.
I love sleeping. 5 minutes. So I was really interested in this. So as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I have in my mind a schema of how, as we grow up from tiny weeny babies, different psychological woundings can occur which arrest that path of development. So this is important. As teeny weeny babies, as we grow up, there are stages of psychological development and stuff can happen that wounds us along the way. So I've worked out how this pattern of wounding impacts upon our practice. And so at a deepest level, what I would suggest to all of us is that if we really try to practice, what that practice is going to do is bring us face to face with our deepest core wounds. And here's a run through of them. A very brief run through of them. For those of us who find the world and relationships frightening and overwhelming, going near our emotions will be particularly challenging. Jerry, a committed meditator, correctly diagnosed that his emotionally flat experience of mindfulness was connected to his generally disconnected relationship to life. If inclined to dissociation, we prefer to sit and calmly space out. For those of us who feel not good enough, like Elizabeth, we will, with our wolf of hate, self-hatred, judge our practice harshly and believe others are better. Pema Chodron speaks of the many letters she receives from the self-titled worst person in the world, who all share the feeling that they are uniquely and exceptionally bad at practicing meditation. For those of us who find being a separate and autonomous person confusing, feeling suffocated in a group yet uneasy when alone, it may be difficult to choose and settle with just one practice group. This is not the entirely legitimate initial search for someone who fits a qualified teacher, but is something that could prevent us from ever being at home and growing within a community of practitioners. I've got that one. I'm terrified of Dharma groups. For those of us with an inflated sense of our own value and who feel easily used, meeting our hidden and vulnerable underbelly will be hard. Felix says, nothing throughout the first weeks of the 8-week mindfulness course, but by the end it becomes clear he is subtly signalling his superiority. Doing everything just a bit more mindfully than everyone else, he speaks, disclosing that he has learnt mindfulness many years before, but now applies it in his own way. Being part of the group, being ordinary and getting things wrong is simply unbearable. Being vulnerable to vulnerability, Felix has what some Buddhist meditation teachers call the I know problem. For those of us who are suppressed by excess discipline, we will resist external influence, feeling our lives depend upon it. To change is to lose. This is a particularly tough one because we are fighting against ourselves. If we begin to allow change, we immediately must prevent it. Like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, we are powerful in our immovability. 2 more. For those of us who feel unheard and unseen, who may have been sexually exploited, having particularly expressive and quickly changing emotions, will make it hard for us to settle. Christy, having been such a child, full of thoughts and emotions, found it extremely difficult to slow down and be in her body. To feel the physical sensations of her breathing is just too much. And then lastly, for those of us who are rather uptight and rigid, who come from emotionally cool and controlling backgrounds, we will find the single most important instruction for meditation a difficult task. Just relax. So if we stay with it, we come down to that That's what we're in touch with. And of course the solution is what we've already talked about. Where am I feeling that in my body? With an enormous amount of kindness and compassion, breathing around it, allowing the sensation to be there, not going back into the storyline, recognizing that it arises, stays and falls, and then perhaps that tiny little twitch, that tiny little movement, which is the recognition that all of this arises within the space of awareness. That's it.